Hello, Tom. Thanks for being here today. I've had a few requests for your MBT view on precognition, which I understand it to be um, seeing future events, seeing what's happening in the future. How would MBT science explain precognition?
Well, first of all, the fact that precognition does happen sometimes is a fact. It happens often to some people, happens not at all to other people. But in any case, what is precognition and how does it work? Yes, indeed, it is a real thing, not because people can tell the future or see what must happen, because we have free will and we're not under determinism, we're under free will. There is no future that must happen, but there is a probable future. That's a future that's likely to happen or that can happen. Okay, now we have that. We have things that are likely and unlikely to happen, but we have lots of things that can happen. And each one of these possible things that can happen has a probability associated with it, which is its probability of happening. So that I'm going to walk out of my front door this afternoon and find a gold brick sitting out there worth, a couple of $100,000. That could happen, but it's very unlikely that's going to happen. But there's probably some probability on it, which is probably something like 10 to the minus 30 or something ridiculous like that, 1/1000th of a billionth of a billionth. It's pretty small, but there's nothing that says it's impossible that that would happen. It's just unlikely. So with MBT, we have a different viewpoint of reality than the typical materialist viewpoint. A materialist viewpoint is one that says that there is no such thing as consciousness, there is no such thing as time, there is no such thing as free will. All of those are illusions, and our world is a machine. It's just this thing that keeps cranking on because it is. And that's determinism. Everything's determined. In other words, a physicist would tell you, well, not every physicist, but particularly a physicist that is attached to the old physics would tell you that if you knew the state of every particle in the universe, then you could compute every future state. See, it's just a machine. Everything moves according to the rules of physics. And once you know where everything is and all of its state vectors, which means its velocity, its momenta, its mass, you have all the things, its location, you have all that information about it, whether it's spinning up or spinning down, and all of the things that describe it, and all of the things that describe everything that's around it. If you knew everything, then it would just be a matter of computing what would happen next and next and next, and you could compute everything exactly that would happen from then on. Okay, that's called determinism. Your reality is a machine. It's just following the rules. So that is where materialism takes you. But MBT is not a deterministic, not a materialistic science. It's a broader science than that. It looks at the material world and it's a subset of the larger reality. So it doesn't just look at the material world and say, that's it. So we can calculate everything in the material world. Material world is just a subset. And it's not a bottom-up kind of this particle bumps that particle, which bumps the next particle, and I can keep calculating from the bottom up what happens. It's not like that at all. It's a statistical and probabilistic simulation of reality. So we got to start with that as the core of our understanding of reality, that it is a virtual reality, a computed reality, and that it's not bottom up, but it's probabilistic. Okay, and there is a rule set, and that rule set is what defines what can happen here and what can't. But we, who are the players that make choices for our avatars in this rule set, we have free will. So no one could possibly know what the future would have because we get to change it just by making choices. Now, some of us are probably pretty easy to predict, but sometimes we just do things that are just because we feel like it, are unpredictable. We step out of character or out of line or start thinking out of the box, things that aren't typical for us. And millions, billions of people do that every day, do something odd or zany or just because they feel like it. And that makes it impossible to predict what's going to happen next. But we can write down all the things that could happen. That'd be a long list if we wrote down all the possible things that could happen. It'd be a very long list, but it's a finite list. There's only certain numbers of things that could happen, particularly if we say that we're not interested in trivial things, but we're interested in things that have a causal line forward. In other words, if I just raise my hand in the air and put it back down, that doesn't cause anything else to happen. Well, it causes a few air molecules to shift position, but none of that really leaves a causal chain, into the future. So if we only limit it to things that do have causal change into the future, then it's a pretty finite list of all the possibilities that could happen given the state that everything's in right now. And every one of those possibilities has a probability. Some things are very likely, some things are not so likely, like the gold brick on my front porch is one of the things that's not very likely. That I will have mail in my mailbox when I go out tonight to walk the dogs and look at my mailbox. That's a very high probability. I doubt that there are 1 or 2 days out of the year that I do not find any mail in my mailbox. So I could say that it's pretty likely that when I look in my mailbox, there's going to be something in there because I get 5 or 10 or 20 things in my mailbox every day. So that's what I mean by we live in a probabilistic reality. This is a computed virtual reality. And the physical world, the objective world, as the scientists would call it, is just a subset of it. Okay, that's one virtual reality. There's other virtual realities. It's not the only virtual reality. That's just a subset of this bigger thing. Now, in order to compute this virtual reality, the system has to have some idea of what's going to happen next because it has to render what happens next. So how does it know what to render? You see, if this were a bottoms up, well, that wouldn't be a question what to render because you know all the states of everything and what happens next is you just keep progressing. This ball runs into that ball, then that ball's going to move next. That's what's going to happen. And that ball will crash into something else. And that's what's going to happen. So we can just follow the logic of it if we're doing bottoms up, and that tells us what's going to happen next. But in a probabilistic reality, it's not like that. We just look at it from the probability viewpoint. So we have to have some way of knowing what to render next, right? A virtual reality based on probability. All right, so what's going to happen next? We can't look at the logic underneath of it, but we can just look at the probabilities that create that logic. All right, so the way the system works with this is that it creates a database of everything that can happen and the probability of it happening. So it just looks at all the possibilities. And again, there's some level beneath which it doesn't care, things that have no future states that depend on it. They have no causality into the future. But like the hand going up or down, it doesn't really cause anything in the future to happen. That's significant. So we look at all those things that can happen and the probability of them. Now, I take that distribution and I take a random draw from that distribution to see what happens next. Okay, so we have free will. And that means there is no future that must happen. There's only what might happen. And it's based on my choices. Because every time I make a choice, there's some things that were possible that aren't so much anymore, or were likely that aren't so much anymore, and other things that weren't likely that become more likely. Okay, so it changes things. So I decide that I'm going to marry Susie instead of Sally. Okay, and when I make that decision, that's a choice. And it changes a whole lot of things. It's going to change my life and Susie's life and Sally's life and Susie's and Sally's parents and her brothers and sisters and my brothers and sisters and my parents and everybody that knows us now. Their life is going to be a little different because of that decision I made. And that's the way it is with everything. You go out and buy something. Well, now that's something that the store doesn't have anymore. They're going to have to get another one of those. So it comes up on their list. Your action creates another action that creates another reaction. So the store goes and orders it from the supplier. The supplier has to go order it from the raw materials to make it. And it all has a causal chain. So all of these things have probabilities. And when we wanted to know what is going to happen next, well, we look at all the probabilities and we take the random draw from the probability distribution of the possibilities. Now, that random draw is not a random draw of all the possibilities. That's different. If that was the case, then this would be a crazy world, because things that were only 1 in a million would just happen because it was just a random draw. It's a random draw from the probability distribution of the possibilities, which means those things that are more likely to happen, have higher probabilities, are more likely to come out of that random draw. That's how it is when you take a draw from a probability distribution, not from just the possibilities. So the system does that because it has to compute things that are unknown. I dig a hole in my front yard. I don't know what's in there. Roots, rocks, dirt, a gold coin. Who knows what might be in there? A bone? Because nobody knows. I take a big shovelful and I turn it over, and how does the system know what to put in there? It's a probabilistic thing. Well, it just takes a random draw from all the possibilities that are likely to be in there, and that's what's going to be in that shovel full of dirt. Well, mostly it's going to be dirt, maybe some stones, maybe a bone, maybe an old tin can lid, hard to say, maybe an arrowhead. So the system creates a probability database of everything that can happen and the probability it does. And it creates this database because it needs that information. A lot of people digging holes, scientists looking at the stars, things that never been seen before, all of these things that are unknown and have uncertainty to them, then it has to know what to put there. So that's how it works. And that's true for everything that we do, the stuff that happens to us. Now, mostly we're not too surprised, because mostly, like I say, those random draws from the probability distributions are just what we would expect, because that's what is very likely. So it just seems to us very natural that life just goes on, and things that we expect to happen generally do happen because they have the higher probability. So it seems normal to us that it works that way. But the system now has this giant database. And this database is of all the possible things and their probability. I call that the probable future database. It's not the future, it's just a probable future. And because we are consciousness, we can get around in that database. That means we can query it. We can get information from it. We can get an understanding of what the possibilities are and what the probabilities are. And we can even do what-if analysis there. I can say, well, okay, what if I had married Sally instead of Sue? I married Sue instead of Sally, and I've done, now I've been married to Sue for 30 years. But I wonder, what would happen if I married Sally instead back then? Well, I can go back in the database and I can look through the probabilities and say, because see, that probable future turns into to the past as time goes by. So all that data is still there. It doesn't just get to the present and then evaporate. It all gets kept in the past. So I could go back there and I could say, well, okay, let's look at the probabilities. I married Sally now. What would happen? And I could follow that out if I wanted to know what the most likely thing that would be if I did that. Then what would that do? How would that affect me and my friends and my family and her friends? And I could work that out. Now, of course, the farther out I go, the rattier it gets because it's just probability. It's just what could have happened. It's not what did happen. So I'd come up with some answers, but that wouldn't necessarily be exactly what would have happened because it's all based on the probability from that time. That's what's in the database, you see. So if I actually did marry her, it wouldn't be the thing I saw. It would have been something different because we have free will and we would have changed all the probabilities as we went through our life. But from that point in time, the probabilities are saved, and I could look from that point in time what looked most probable. So people get into this database. It's available to us. The past, which is just the older part of this database, it's now the past. Once time goes past that point, they can get back and look in the past. They can look into the future, and all these databases are available to us. Matter of fact, that's how remote viewers can remote view. They're just getting data out of the database. There's no magic, magic mind goes out and sees things. They're just collecting data out of the database. People who see auras are just getting information. Medical intuitives that see people getting ill, or maybe the people are going to die. All of that is just getting data out of the databases. They're looking at what is probable, what's going to happen. And some things have very high probabilities. Maybe they're a month away or a year away, and they have very high probabilities for happening. Other things have very, probabilities coming and going all the time. It changes, but some aren't. So that's what happens when we have precognitive messages, dreams. Usually they say precognitive dreams, but it doesn't have to be a dream.
You teach all of these things, that we have these abilities as consciousness, but how would you explain to someone who simply looks at someone and gets a message, how that is not a particular trained thing or a particular thing that was asked for, but simply gets the message? You gave a lot of good examples about what is most probable, citing some archaeology, some digs. And of course, the probabilities there would be depending on the venue, the location rather. If you're digging in an area that was a former Roman town, the probability would be high to find Roman coins and things like that, and occasionally some odd things. But those people that can just look at someone and get instantly some information, how would you explain that part?
Well, that is because that person is conscious. They are consciousness. Again, we are consciousness. We're not our body. Our body is the avatar in a virtual reality. We are consciousness. And the way you query this database is with an intent. So if you have an intent, let's say if you just care about somebody, maybe it's your grandfather, and you just care about grandfather because he's just very special to you. You care about him. So when you see grandfather sitting over there in his big old chair, you just think about, grandfather, he's getting kind of old. I hope he goes a long time. And just the fact that you're thinking about grandpa and his age and hope he stays around a long time, that can turn into a query in the database about how long will grandpa live? When is grandpa likely to die? Now, you may not word it and you may not even intentionally send that query, but just an inquisitive mind who goes out and connects with people, that mind will have those kinds of questions in it. Not necessarily right up in the intellect, but that question is just somewhere a little deeper level than the intellect, saying, I wonder when grandpa, will move on. He's now in his 80s, he's not going to live for another 50 years. So I sure well miss him and all of that. But that little question just kind of, not that you spared a lot of time on it, but it's there. And when it's there, it goes out, gets the data. That's a query. That's how you query the databases, with an intent. So people who care about other people and are connected to them often will have these things come to them because it is part of their mind. Oh, I wonder how so-and-so's doing. And maybe you're a mother and you've got children and your children are all out of the house doing something because they're teenagers and they're out doing their own thing. And you just think, gee, I wonder how Jimmy's getting along in camp. You know, and just because your mind goes to Jimmy being at camp and how is he doing, you start to get some pictures back. You start to get the feeling back. You get some emotion back of how Jimmy's doing in camp. And that's data out of those databases. So that's how it just happens. So sometimes you may look at somebody and you may get the message that grandpa's going to die next week or next month, or he only has a year left. And you get that kind of a message back.
That brings up the question, when you get this information, you're getting the highest probability at the time that you're receiving it, but the information is not necessarily written in stone. So how does that play out?
Well, of course, if you get the message back that grandpa is going to die in 3 weeks, that doesn't mean he's going to die in 3 weeks. That just means at this point in time, right now, the probabilities are such that it seems most likely that he's going to die in 3 weeks. Now, that things can change. So grandpa may live for another week, maybe another year. It just depends. So things that were likely, those probabilities are changing all the time. It's just the nature of reality that everything affects everything else. So everything's in flux and changing. That's why the system has to look at all the possibilities, because those probabilities are always changing. So anyway, so that's how that works. So the reason that people just get something intuitive, and then once that happens, they say, oh, gee, I got that fact that grandpa was going to die in 3 weeks, and he did. And then they start paying attention more to their thoughts and their intentions. And pretty soon they start saying, gee, I can do this a lot. I can tell when people are going to die, or I can tell things that are going to happen in the future. And they start actually focusing more on asking those questions. So they get better at it. And pretty soon it's something that's kind of a talent of theirs that they're good at. You see, anybody can develop their intuitive side. This is intuition. You're developing your intuitive muscles, not your logic muscles, but your intuitive muscles. And you build up those intuitive muscles to where they can be pretty accurate and very reliable. Matter of fact, they can be just as accurate and just as reliable as your intellectual muscles. Those analyzing logical thoughts that you have, your intuitive thoughts can be also accurate. Now, most people don't develop their intuitive side. Their intuitive side has no intentional development at all, and therefore it's not very reliable. It's often not correct. They get a lot of wrong things because their intuition, just a reflection of their ego, of what they want to happen and what they don't want to happen and what they're afraid of happening and so on. That just colors everything very strongly. So they don't really get data out of the database. They get a lot of ego stuff that they feed because of what they want to hear, what they don't want to hear, what they're afraid of. So in any case, people can gather this information, and those people who have intuition of what's going to happen, which is really what we're talking about, they intuitively know that things will happen. Well, they don't really know what's going to happen. They just know what is likely to happen. So just because somebody intuitively says, oh, I predict this will happen and I'm good at this, it may or may not happen. Depends on how changeable those probabilities are. So that's how it works. It is part of the science. It just falls out naturally out of our understanding of the nature of reality that some people will sometimes be able to see future possibilities that come true. And if they develop that skill, they can do it, 80, 90% of the time, they can get it right, as opposed to 50% if they were just guessing at a binary. Or if it's not binary, then 5 or 10%. So it's a developable skill. And just like remote viewing is a developable skill, remote viewing gets data out of the database.
these things are possible to us because as consciousness, these are things we can do. There are people, though, who have these gifts from a very young age. How does that work in your theory?
Well, yeah, we think that some people have gifts, and what the gift they have is not the gift of reading minds or seeing futures or getting data out of the past or future probable databases. They have a gift of being able to focus their mind. They have a gift of not having a noisy mind, having a low, a low noise mind that doesn't have a lot of stray thoughts running around it all the time. They have a gift of being generally relaxed and calm. At least they can make themselves calm in their minds for certain periods of time. And they have a gift of imagination, being able to stretch their mind out, being able to be creative, see, what can I say? See bigger pictures. They just have a sense of intuition that they have developed, I guess is another way to say it. Now, I noticed that particularly people who had very challenging childhoods, where they were often abused or they were in a very negative situation and they had to deal with this constant negativity, constant harassment all the time from a very young age. Well, in order to escape that, in order to survive, they kind of let go of that objective physical world and they spend more time in a subjective space, in an intuitive space. So their way of escaping that is through their imagination, through their opening up other channels. And it's these people who often then grow up into adults that are mediums. And these are the people that help the police find the bad guy, because they have a picture in their mind of what the hideout looks like. And you could say they were gifted, but basically they develop it because of what they pay attention to and what they don't. They stop paying attention so much to the physical world because that's harsh and unpleasant and painful. And they start paying more attention then to their intuitive side, to their imaginative side. And they develop those skills and they learn how to separate what's imagination from what's not, from intuition that's not coming from them, but coming from these databases or other things. So they practice and develop those skills. Some people may be born more relaxed and at ease with low noise. Yes, that's true on occasion. You always start your life from the quality of consciousness you learned the last time. So if you're a pretty high quality of consciousness, you'll be more attuned to people and to things and to the intuitive side, from a very early age. But in general, the people that I know who are very good at these, at an intuition, very good at looking at probable futures and pasts, very good at remote viewing, very good at collecting data out of these databases. They're people who have just taken the time to develop their intuitive side. Some, like I say, just by good luck or bad luck, they were put in situations where they had to develop that. That was how they hung on. That's how they kept themselves sane in an insane environment. Others just started with it, found that it worked, like with Grandpa. Oh, I got that right. Gee, I should try that with other people and see what I see. And then they just start developing and playing with it. And 10 years, 20 years later, they're much better at it. And so some of it's just happenstance, that they just pay attention to the details and they're not committed to, materialism, determinism. Because if they are, then they just say, oh, well, it's just an anomaly. Forget that. Or it frightens them. How could I do that? Oh, that's scary. What happened? Did a demon tell me that? Or if they're religious, and they get freaked out and push it away. But many people don't, so they live with it, and their
Well,
intuition grows.
it's very nice to know that these things are natural skills that can be developed. And what you've given us is an explanation of both that you can develop them as consciousness and that the gifts come naturally or out of a sense of fine tuning your mind, needing to do that to survive. So you've placed what
Mhm.
you call your probable future databases into a scientific explanation for precognition. So
Into a
thank you.
logical, yeah, my model's a logical model. And one other thing I might say about this precognition. So we have people who look at tea leaves and teacups and come up with future. We have people that the old thing, right? That throw the chicken bones, on the ground, and then you look at how the chicken bones fall, and they make prognostications about the future. And people who do horoscopes and look at where all the planets are and so on, and they do prognostications about what's happening in the future. I would say that almost all of these ways of prognostication, it's all based on randomness. You see, the tea leaves just fall in random patterns. The sticks from the I Ching all just fall in random patterns. The planets and things aren't that random, but there's so many of them that have interplay with each other that if you look at all the possibilities, that's kind of random as well. So what you have is that people have these modalities that they use to help focus their intents on getting that information. So these things, the tea leaves are a tool for letting them focus their intent to get into that state where their mind is quiet, where they relax, where they let everything else go, they drop the physical reality, they go out and they have an intent for data and they bring it back. And they see all that in the tea leaves, but that's what they've learned, you see. So the tea leaves are a random event that they then use as a tool for gathering data out of the databases. And you can kind of see that because if you look at an astrologer who's casting horoscopes, they have to be kind of left alone and do that at a time of quiet where they can get their mind in the right frame to do that. You see, they're not casting horoscopes while they're taking care of 3 children and cooking dinner. They have to wait till all the kids are in bed and then they can go do this. Well, why would that be? And it's the same, like computers can do horoscopes, but they're in the newspapers. Our computer computes everybody's horoscope for today. But nobody takes those too seriously because they're either so general, they don't tell you anything, but they wouldn't be right because that's just a machine. That's not how it works. Getting data out of the database is more of how it works. So yes, you can be an astrologer with a computer and you'll get some things right some of the time. But if you're an astrologer that looks at your astrology and gets data out of the database, now you can get a lot of very detailed things right and be right on the money
So
because
it's the consciousness that is
it's the
the key.
consciousness is the key.
Yeah.
Yeah, consciousness and the tapping into these databases, that's the active ingredient. And you may have lots of other ways that helps you do that, like the remote viewers. They have certain protocols that help them do that. But the active ingredient there isn't the protocols, it's the intent, focusing on getting data from a database and getting that data in a format that is useful. Now, those tea leaves can be the format. Okay, you can look at that, you can say, I want it in words, I want it in pictures, I want it in words and pictures, I want it in colors and smells and feelings. So you get to decide how that format that you get the output data. So if you take something like tea leaves, you can say, well, my format is that this little thing, if these tea leaves lump up over here, well, that means this. And if they do this, and if there's a little dot of them around the side, that means this. And I can come up with all of these tea leaf reading rules, right? And that becomes my output format. So that's how I get it. I just look at my tea leaves and my information that I get is expressed that way instead of words or pictures. It's tea leaves that happen to fall in a particular thing that tells me things. See, that's just the output format. So yes, they are looking at the tea leaves, and yes, they are telling you what the tea leaves tell them, but all of it is really a connection to these databases, and the database has the quality that it will give you the information in whatever format you want. So if you say, well, the format is planets and moons and whatever, well, those planets and moons are in a particular place. They're not in random positions, but again, there's lots of them and lots of things that interact with each other. And there's so much complexity to the system that you can use it in the same way. Any system that's terribly complex, you can use it very much in the same way you use a random system. You can make it mean whatever you need it to mean to give you the answer that you got from the consciousness system. So now there may be some other things going on in astrology. I don't mean to tell people that's all that's going on in astrology. There may be, and I don't know that there is, but there may be some other possibilities that are going on there. But we don't need to discuss that here. That's not what our topic is. But there's a lot of what's going on there has to do with the consciousness to consciousness connection. We are consciousness. The system is consciousness. The computer that computes the system, the rendering engine, is consciousness. Consciousness is an information system, and it can configure itself as a computer or as me and you. It can configure itself as pieces of consciousness, playing a virtual reality game, which is rendered by a piece of consciousness in the form of a computer. So consciousness is fundamental. Everything else is virtual. So that's how we have people and things that can look into the future, like tea leaves and I Ching sticks and other sorts of bones, chicken bones, and other sorts of things like that. They're random events which can be manipulated because they're random by the system as an output format for the database. The output format now is chicken bones. So if somebody's going to die, then I want these chicken bones to line up, with whatever the sign would be for death. So because you throw them and they fill randomly, the system it's a virtual reality. Those are virtual chicken bones, right? The system can put them in any arrangement it wants to, as long as it looks random. So,
well, thank you. This is a very, very interesting way to place what people know as precognition into your My Big Toe probable future database theory. So very interesting. Thank you so much.
I and MBT Events hope you liked this video. We now have well over 1,000 hours of free video on this user-friendly, ad-free YouTube channel. Though these videos are free to our viewers, they represent many thousands of hours in production and editing, and many thousands of dollars invested in video and audio equipment, along with the required computers and software to store and process the raw video into finished products. So far, all of this content has been funded directly out of our own pockets. Be assured, we will always continue to do what we can. It's our life, our purpose, a labor of love that we will continue to pursue as best we can. However, those pockets are not as deep as they used to be. Thus, we are now seeking to augment our resources with support from our viewers. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our newly created Patreon account or through a one-time donation. The links are in the description below. Thank you.